Okay, well, good evening. It is 6 o'clock, so we will get started for the night. Welcome back. Um, I know we still have several people who will be joining us along the way, so we'll go ahead and get started since you're all here. I want to make sure that I don't waste any of your time tonight. Thank you very much for your postings in Canvas essay number 2. All of those postings that were made by at least 5 o'clock today, I've had a chance to go and take a look at and provide you feedback on, but I think they were all very good. And so no issues with any of those posts. If you did post after 5 o'clock, it just means I haven't had a chance to take a look at it, but I will take a look at those after class tonight. Make sure to get all those wrapped up for the week. Then you have Canvas essay number 3 that is coming up next. For Canvas essay number 3, you're going to draw upon the information that we'll cover tonight, looking at our first real school of organization theory, which is the classical school. And I think that what we had talked about last week is we had really laid the foundation for what is organization theory. We talked about some of the differences between public and private sector organizations and why those differences are important for why we study organization theory here in an MPA program. And we also talked about some of the ways in which we're going to compare all these different, sometimes disparate, but sometimes similar theories and schools of thought that we're going to cover as we go through this evolution of the organization theory literature. And I reintroduced you to the Tompkins approach of looking at the models of organizational effectiveness, the methods for coordination and control, and then the methods for motivation. And those are the three, as we talked about last week, three bases that we will use to compare each one of our different schools of thought together. And so we're going to keep going with that theme tonight. And as we talk about the classic organization theorists like Weber and Taylor and Fayol and Gulick, what we will do is we'll then return to this typology that's provided to us by Tompkins and look at what model of organizational effectiveness each one of those schools favors, what methods for coordination of control, as well as what types of methods for motivating employees. I know that we left off last week because we didn't have enough time to do our breakout rooms. I do promise we will do the breakout rooms tonight. What I would like to do, though, is to start off covering this information on the classical school of organization theory, because this is information that you'll then be using in the breakout rooms that we'll do later on tonight. And you'll then also be using this information to inform Canvas essay number 3, and then also using this information to then inform that section of your organizational analysis paper, as well as that part of your organizational analysis presentation. I also have had two people who have reached out and said that they are willing to do their presentations on June the 24th, so 2 weeks from tonight, Damien and Ben. So thank you very much for that. If there's anyone else who would prefer to do their presentation on June 24th as opposed to our last class session on July 1st, we can probably accommodate maybe 3 or 4 more folks to do their presentations on June 24th. Help us clear the decks a little bit so that on July 1st, we will have ample time to do the remaining presentations. I won't have to keep you here beyond 2 hours and 45 minutes. But so if you have that interest, just send me an email and let me know, and I'll get you on the schedule for June the 24th. So again, the agenda tonight, talk about the School of Classic Organization Theory, and then we'll take a break. And then after the break, we'll break up into our breakout rooms. And then I have a really short prompt that we can work on in our breakout rooms. After each of our breakout rooms finish their work, probably about 30, 40 minutes working in your breakout rooms, we'll then reconvene as a class. And then each room can share out what you came up with. We'll then reassess our time for the evening and we'll see if we have enough time left to work ahead a little bit and start introducing some neoclassical thoughts, neoclassical schools. If we do have time to do that, we'll do that tonight. If not, then we'll just hold that in abeyance until our class session next week. So, with that agenda in place, are there any questions about any of the information that we covered last week, or really anything at all before we get into our discussion of classic organization theory?
I have a question, Dr. Powell. I'm not sure if I missed the clarification of the readings, but when I was reading Weber, Taylor, and Gulick, I found them in the um Tompkins. Was it the
The classics text, the Shafferings?
E? Yes, because I
Yes.
was trying to figure out like what where are the readings from? So when I was reading Weber, Taylor, and Gulick, I found them in the Tompkins text. And then when I was trying to look for chapter 4 and 6 in the classics, it didn't make sense for me to read 4 through 6 when I haven't read 1 and 3.
Yeah, I
Does
think
anybody?
Yeah, I think we've inverted the two. And so for the
Oh,
chapter
okay.
numbers themselves, those are from Tompkins. And
Okay.
then the actual articles by Weber and Taylor and Gulick, those are then located in the classics text. And so I've included the last names of the authors for the articles you're reading out of the classics text because I know some people will be using different versions of the classics text. And so putting numbers in there doesn't make a lot of sense because what is a
Okay.
number for one person may be a different number for another. So the chapter numbers are from Tompkins, and then the names of the authors, those articles are in classics.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure. So for tonight, we're going to start out with classic organization theory, and you probably remember some of this from your PPA 500 course. If you took PPA 500 with me, we spent about a week talking about public administration theory and the development of all these different schools of organization theory, but we just kind of hit them from about the 30,000-foot level. And so we don't really dig into them in a whole lot of detail. Here in this class, we're afforded the opportunity to really get into some details on a lot of these theories that you may have first been presented to you back in PPA 500. Max Weber, who is our first classical theorist, that is an author that was presented to you back in your PPA 500 course. So you'll probably have a working familiarity with Max Weber, but we'll do a lot more in terms of details on Max Weber this evening. But where we always start with our discussion of the organization theory literature is always with Max Weber and his writings from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. So if you want to put a time frame on this chronological development, we are starting in the late 1800s. Max Weber, I know it's spelled Weber, but it's pronounced Weber. He was German, Austrian, had a background in sociology, and he was very interested in organizations and the formal aspects of organizations. Now, it's important to note that Max Weber was not a public administration theorist. Just like a lot of these people we talk about in this class were not originally public administration theorists, in that they did not develop their theories oriented around public organizations. But rather, what we have done is we have taken their theories and we have learned that we can modify those theories and give them applicability to public organizations. As you probably also know from your 500 class, the field of public administration is multidisciplinary. It is probably one of the most multidisciplinary fields that you're ever going to find, in that we have authors that come to us from sociology, some that come to us from psychology, we have political scientists, we have theorists from the world of business. We even have theorists that come to us from the world of natural sciences and from physics and from biology. So we have engineers as well that are represented in our organization theory literature. So because we are so multidisciplinary, we have to recognize that a lot of these theories were developed for other purposes rather than being developed directly to apply to public organizations. But Max Weber, in developing his theories more generally, kind of writ large for organizations, was really looking at this idea of rationality. Max Weber was a big believer in rationality. He really questioned the notion that we should base our decisions upon what we feel or what we believe. He believed instead of that, we should base our decisions on empirical evidence and law. So, law that is written and emerges from the analysis of empirical evidence. And we are all familiar with the term empirical. We know empirical means that it's information that is tangible, information that can be collected, information that can be analyzed, that can then be categorized, all the types of things that we typically do today in social science research. So he really wanted to base our decisions on empirical evidence. That's what he considered to be rationality. And he held bureaucratic organizations in very high esteem. He felt that bureaucratic organizations reflected the highest level of rationality. And so he felt if we could really organize our institutions in a very legal, rational type of way, then we will be able to make better decisions, more effective decisions, and we could also make decisions that could be applied in a variety of different situations. So he is very much kind of espousing some of the views that we oftentimes have as social science researchers. So he wanted to focus on organizations and specifically organization structures. Now, in order for an organization to be effective, at the end of the day, that was the primary goal with Max Weber, to make these bureaucratic organizations as effective as possible. And for Max Weber, effectiveness was essentially achieving goals. So these rational organizations would establish goals. These will hopefully be relatively clear goals that are accepted goals. And then organizations are effective if they are making progress to and achieving those stated goals. And so his primary goal, no pun intended, was to look at these organizations and then come up with a way to structure these organizations to help them achieve their goals, because that is what will then make them effective. Weber felt that there was a universal way to do this, that we could come up with the essentially one best way to structure an organization. And then if we impose that bureaucratic structure on all of our organizations, that structure will then lead all those organizations to effectiveness. We allow all those organizations to then achieve their goals. But to get people within organizations, to get these bureaucrats working within these bureaucracies, in order to get these bureaucrats to work toward these goals, we needed some type of authority. We needed to have authority over these individuals so that we could motivate them and compel them to work toward being more productive to achieve the goals of the organization. So Weber was really interested in the basis of authority. He wanted to know where power and authority comes from. And I think we had a previous class last week, probably, we talked about very briefly this idea of power. And we said that power is exercising influence over someone else to get them to do something they otherwise would not do. And that's essentially power and authority. But where do the resources come from, and where does the legal standing come from that can provide a leader with that authority to then compel people to take actions they otherwise would not take? Weber says there are three different bases or types of authority. There's charismatic authority, there's traditional authority, and there's legal rational authority. And I don't think it's very surprising to know which of those three he favored. He clearly favored legal rational. But in terms of charismatic authority is what we see with charismatic leaders. These are people who lead through their personality, who lead through the characteristics of their personality. They lead through their charisma. That's the basis for authority. However, for these charismatic leaders who lead based upon their charisma, based upon their characteristics, the problem with that is that it's a very transient type of authority basis, in that the authority resides within the person. So you follow this person because of who they are. When that person leaves the organization, they take their authority basis with them. So authority is based within the person as opposed to in the position. And that was really troubling for Max Weber, because once that person leaves, then probably the organization is not going to be effective anymore. But that's one basis for authority, charismatic. And later on, when we get to, well, I guess really it's just 2 weeks from now, on June 24th, this summer goes by so quickly. But on June 24th, when we talk about some of the quote unquote more modern organization theories, one school we'll talk about is a school of leadership. And we'll talk about different types of leaders and why people tend to follow charismatic leaders. And just very quickly, there are two reasons why people tend to follow a charismatic leader. One is attribution theory, and the other one is self-concept theory. As I talk about these discrete ideas, I'll put them over in the in-text chat, so you'll at least have a written record of them. But attribution versus self-concept. The attribution approach to charismatic leadership is that people will follow a leader who demonstrates the characteristics that they attribute to good leadership. So someone who has, foresight, someone who has the ability to interact and has good interpersonal skills, who has perhaps a vision for the future of the organization. Those are all attributes that we oftentimes associate with effective leadership. So if we see someone with those attributes, that's the type of person we're going to follow. That's attribution approach to charismatic leadership. The other approach to charismatic leadership is the self-concept approach. We tend to follow leaders who we associate ourselves with. So a leader that you can see yourself in, that maybe reminds you of yourself, and you can see some of yourself in that person, that's a person that you will be willing to follow. So charismatic leaders lead through attribution, self-concept theory. They lead through their own characteristics, their personality, their charisma. The second basis for authority, according to Weber, is the traditional basis for authority. And a traditional basis of authority means that someone has this authority because they've always had this authority. So you think about something like a royal family. And so this divine right of kings. And so we have royal families, that the descendants of these royal families automatically become the rulers of the land because of divine right of kings. And it's just kind of the way we have always done it. So if we adhere to that status quo and we just do it the way we've always done it, the authority for leading comes from that basis of, well, that person's always had that type of power. And so they'll continue to have that power and authority in the future. A traditional approach to authority. Weber, though, believes in this third basis for authority, which is the legal rational. That authority comes from laws, authority comes from the decisions that we are making by analyzing this empirical evidence, this empirical information, by making these rational types of decisions. And he believed that only these bureaucratic organizations had the ability to have this type of legal, rational power or authority basis. As we talked about last week, that's one of our main differences between public and private organizations. Public organizations come into being because of enabling legislation, so they have a legal basis that brings them into existence, as opposed to a private entity that comes into existence probably because an entrepreneur had an idea for making a product and then built that into a company. So that's a different type of basis for authority than what we see in bureaucratic organizations. So he says the charismatic, the traditional, and the legal rational authority bases spawn certain types of administrative systems. They kind of manifest themselves in organizations in different types of ways. Charismatic authority will manifest itself in an organization through charismatic administration, where the administration is organized around this one person, this one charismatic leader. There are problems and there are benefits for charismatic administration. In terms of charismatic administration, the benefit of charismatic administration is that charismatic leaders tend to engender a lot of loyalty on the part of their followers. So when followers follow a charismatic leader, they follow that charismatic leader sometimes to the ends of the earth. And so it's a very strong bond that forms between the follower and the leader. So you've got a lot of that loyalty. The drawback is, as we said on the last slide, it's inherently unstable because the power basis is in the leader, the person, as opposed to being in the formal position. The traditional authority basis, then spawns three different types of administrative systems. It spawns the patriarchal administrative system, the patrimonial administrative system, and the feudal administrative system. So those three middle administrative systems all come out of the traditional authority basis. So in the patriarchal administrative system, you have usually an individual, and that individual governs themselves, and most of the power, if not all the power, resides within that individual. That's a patriarchal type of approach to administration. Again, the idea of a king would be an example of a patriarchal type of administration. A patrimonial type of administrative system is a little bit more decentralized, where the power does not just reside in that one person, but may reside in that person's family members as well. And so this is when you start to get into the royal families. And so a king may delegate some power and authority to their children or to very close family members. And that's a patrimonial type of administrative system. A feudal type of administrative system is where that leader then delegates and decentralizes a lot of authority to their political allies. And I'm sure you took history classes, so you're familiar with the Middle Ages and you're familiar with feudal systems of government where you would have a king that would then give power and give some authority to their political allies in exchange for support from those political allies. So as long as you are supporting the king, you will get land, you will get all these good things as long as you continue to support the king. But it's a much more decentralized and devolved type of administrative structure. The legal rational authority basis is the one that we are interested in here with Max Weber. And Max Weber says the legal rational authority basis spawns this type of administrative system known as the bureaucratic administrative system, where administration is being done by a technical administrator, a bureaucrat, an administrator who has the knowledge, skills, and abilities, or as we call them in public administration, the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities, in order to effectively do the job. So this puts a lot of that power within these career bureaucrats through this system of bureaucratic administration. Weber says our organizations should exhibit a bureaucratic administrative system. And indeed, the vast majority of our bureaucratic organizations exhibit that type of bureaucratic administrative system. But not just any bureaucratic administrative system. He had a specific ideal administrative system in mind, and what became known as the Weberian ideal bureaucracy. So Weber argues that we can have a panacea. We can have a one-size-fits-all approach where we can structure our organizations in this one given way according to this ideal bureaucratic structure, and then apply that ideal bureaucratic structure to all of our organizations, which will then in turn make all of our organizations effective, which means it will make all of our organizations better able to accomplish their goals. So Weber really believed in a one-size-fits-all approach, this universal approach, and really believed in focusing on the structure of the organization. So Weber says this ideal bureaucratic structure consists of all these different elements that you touched upon in hopefully in your PPA 500 class. Things such as division of labor. Our bureaucratic organizations have a lot of work to do. So therefore, in order to get that work done and accomplish our goals, we will divide the labor up among all the different people in our organization. So we will create different positions within our organization and then provide different work to all those different types of positions. Just like in your modern day organization, this is what you have in your modern day organization. You have a position. You have a position description. And that position description tells you this is your job and this is what you are responsible for doing in your job. So we see a lot of this division of labor in our modern day organizations. Also, think about a modern organization that everyone kind of has a negative view of, and that's Congress. Woodrow Wilson famously said that Congress at work is Congress in committees. The real work of Congress goes on within those committees and today those subcommittees. Well, that's division of labor. And so Congress itself has this type of division of labor. Most modern complex organizations have division of labor. When you divide the labor up, each of these positions will then specialize in certain types of tasks. And that's the second concept of specialization of task. So in your position description will say, here are the tasks that you typically do on a daily basis. It will probably have a percentage of time that you spend on each one of those tasks or those activities. Your specialized tasks will probably be different than another person's specialized tasks. So if you're a budget manager, you'll have a certain set of tasks. If you're an HR manager, you'll have a different set of tasks. So division of labor then leads to specialization of task. When people specialize in the same tasks day in and day out, they obviously become experts at those jobs. They know those jobs better than anyone else in the organization. So division of labor then creates specialization of task. Specialization of task then creates expert status on the part of our employees. These administrators, these bureaucrats then become experts in what they do on a daily basis. And that kind of feeds into last week where we talked about the principal agent relationship. That's why these agents usually have more information than the principals who are meant to then oversee them. These bureaucratic organizations, this ideal bureaucracy, also has a very stringent structure, a structure by which we have power that flows down from the top. It's a very tall hierarchical system. And as you know from your 500 class, the tall hierarchy is a structure that looks like a pyramid. That's a very weird looking pyramid, but a pyramid where you have one person at the apex of the organization, one person who is ultimately in charge of the organization. And then as you go down the organizational structure, you then encounter more and more positions. The plurality of your positions are then located at the bottom of your organization structure. In this tall hierarchical system, orders flow down from above, directions flow down from above. And there is what is called a chain of command or a unity of command. This chain of command, this unity of command, means that everyone knows to whom they are accountable. Everyone has a boss, everyone has a supervisor, and that is very well spelled out in this organizational chart. We also, within this unity of control, have what's known as a span of control. So every manager in that organization is responsible for a limited number of employees located below them. That's your span of control. So if you're a middle level manager, you're not going to be responsible for everyone in the organization chart who's located below your position. You may be responsible for 3 people or 5 people or 7 people who are located below you in this organization chart. That's the span of control. We have a limited span of control for our managers in the organization. Our organizations are also very rule bound. We develop rules and we adhere to implementing those rules. That's very important for a legal, rational authority basis. We have to have these laws, we have to have these rules and processes and regulations. This is something that a lot of people get frustrated with in bureaucratic organizations because as organizations get older, they tend to develop more and more policies and rules and procedures. And those policies and rules will then overlay on top of previous policies and rules. And that policy manual then gets bigger and bigger and bigger as that organization gets older. Look at Administrative Procedures Act and all these rules that have been written by different federal agencies and just rule on top of rule on top of rule. You also think about something like the tax code, the income tax code. The reason why the income tax code, well, there are a lot of reasons, but one reason why the income tax code is so incredibly complicated and convoluted is because you have had tax law that has been passed in piecemeal fashion by Congress year after year. And so the rules that were passed in the Tax Reform Act in 1986 are overlaid upon the rules from the Balanced Budget Acts in the 1990s, overlaid on top of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, overlaid then on top of whatever comes out of the negotiations that are going on in the US Senate on the reconciliation bill currently. So you have this proliferation of rules. Proliferation of rules can be bad because it really can end up being a lot of this red tape that we have to navigate our way through when we deal with bureaucratic organizations. However, red tape can be good as well, in that it shows us what we need to do and how we need to do it so that we can then apply these rules uniformly to everyone, regardless of situation. So therefore, we are not exploiting individuals. We are not treating people in an arbitrary or capricious or prejudicial manner. We are simply applying the rules. These administrators who are working in this ideal bureaucratic structure are professional administrators, and they're also career administrators. They are professional, they have the skills necessary in order to do these jobs, and they are also career employees in that they look at their employment in this organization as a career. They're not free agents who are going to bounce from one organization to another. They are in this organization for an entire career. And everything that we do in the organization, whether it be documenting interacting with a citizen or documenting the results of a performance evaluation and attempts to try and mitigate problems with performance, all those things have to be written down. We rely upon these as written documentation. So organizations need to exhibit all these different characteristics that Weber referred to as an ideal bureaucracy. And again, Weber believed if we could structure all of our organizations to adhere to these different aspects of the ideal bureaucracy, that is where we make organizations effective. That's how organizations can then effectively achieve their goals. Now, Weber, obviously, when we look at Weber in terms of our models of organizational effectiveness, it's very clear that Weber is going to really focus on the rational goal model. And so, again, as a recap, Tompkins tells us we have these four different models of organizational effectiveness, how we determine when an organization is being effective. For Weber's ideal bureaucratic theory, we know an organization is being effective when it's achieving its goals. So clearly, the rational goal model is one of the models of organizational effectiveness that comes out of a Weberian type of approach. As you know from our discussion last week, the rational goal model of organizational effectiveness falls at the bottom right of our matrix, which means that the rational goal model of organizational effectiveness favors control, a lot of this top-down control in our organizational structure. And it's also on the right side of our chart, which means that there's an external focus. The reason why there's an external focus is because a lot of these goals, or at least the impetus for these goals for our organizations, are established outside the organization itself. So if you've ever participated in a strategic planning process for an organization, you know that there are limitations and constraints that are placed upon you in identifying your goals because your goals need to flow from your mission. And your mission probably will flow from your enabling legislation that has been given to you by whatever legislative body has created your organization. So sometimes these goals are going to be beyond the control of the organization, giving it that external focus. That's why it's a rational goal model of organizational effectiveness. However, Tompkins argues, and I agree with Tompkins, that there's a second model of organizational effectiveness that's emphasized here as well, and that's the internal process model. Because in the internal process model, our ultimate goal is to coordinate the activities within our organization. And we coordinate those activities primarily through control. That type of control comes from this type of idealized organizational structure, this top-down tall hierarchy with division of labor, specialization of tasks, so on and so on. So those are your two models that we see coming out of a Weberian ideal bureaucratic theory, rational goal model, as well as an internal process model. So there's both an external as well as an internal approach, but both of those models both emphasize control over flexibility. in that the control is flowing down through the organization structure, very top-down, centralized type of control. In terms of our mechanisms for control and coordination, since power and authority is flowing downhill from the top of the organization down through the organizational chart, obviously one mechanism is going to be direct supervision. So there's a lot of direct supervision. This is how the job needs to be done, and make sure that people do the job in that way. Standardization of work processes. Again, well, rational approach means we have to standardize things to make sure that everyone knows what they are doing and make sure that these standards can be applied in all situations. Standardization of worker skills, making sure our professionals, career employees, have the skills that they need in order to do the jobs that they need to do within their respective positions. And then in terms of motivational strategies, the primary motivational strategy is legal compliance. So we motivate people through punitive measures. We motivate people by holding them accountable to these rules and procedures and processes. So if someone is chronically late to work, they are going to be held accountable for that with punitive measures. So maybe if they're chronically late for work, they're going to get docked in their pay, or they're no longer going to be eligible for a reward, employee of the week, or eligible for a promotion. That type of approach is called legal compliance. So here are the rules. You need to abide by those rules. If you don't comply with those rules, then there will be consequences. Now, Weber, one of the advantages of Weber, if it works, is that a Weberian approach, at least according to Weber, could be then applied across different organizations. And so if we want to help an organization be effective, we take that organization, we restructure it to make it adhere to this ideal bureaucratic structure, and then that will help that organization achieve its goals. We know the primary limitation of that is that we have very few universal rules, that it's very difficult for us to put together a theory and then apply that theory across every single situation. And indeed, that's one of the themes we have seen throughout the entire evolution of the organization theory literature, is that the search for the one-size-fits-all approach is really very much of a fruitless search, that we have to take into account the context of the situation. Different organizations, as we talked about last week, have different functions, different employees, they have different missions, they have different environments, they use different technologies. There are differences in these organizations, which means a one-size-fits-all approach is simply not going to work. Another limitation of a Weberian idealized bureaucratic approach is the dehumanizing nature of the theory, in that Weber did not pay a lot of attention to individual employees. He thought these individual employees could be pigeonholed into their jobs, be given their position descriptions, essentially what we call today a position description, and then monitored to make sure they do their jobs. There wasn't any real consideration for the social needs of these individuals, for any of their needs for growth as individuals or human resource development. Weber was pretty much devoid of all of that. So it was a very dehumanizing kind of, again, as I said, one size fits all approach for every organization and for every single employee within those organizations. And it's important for us to recognize those limitations because, as I mentioned last week, those limitations are the reasons why we had new schools of thought develop. So the neoclassical schools developed because of some of these criticisms associated with classical authors like Max Weber and then Frederick Taylor and others. So we have to recognize those limitations to understand why we had these new schools of thought and these new theories developed to even begin with. But Max Weber represents for us our first real classical theorist with his ideal bureaucratic structure. So Max Weber, writing in the late 1800s into the very early 1900s, kind of gets us started with our evolution of organization theories. The next person who I categorize as a classical theorist, and you'll see at times I really do part company with Tompkins in terms of his classifications. Tompkins pulls Frederick Taylor out from Max Weber and kind of pulls them out and puts them in two different schools. I kind of like to clump them together into the classical school because they shared some very similar approaches, although they did have some differences. They shared some similar approaches. One of those shared approaches was this one size fits all approach. Our classical theorists tend to focus on this panacea that we can apply in every situation. And the other thing that makes him a classical theorist in my mind is his dehumanizing approach to individual employees. But Frederick Taylor comes to us primarily from the world of business. And so Frederick Taylor was developing his theories primarily for business organizations, for corporations. His theory, his primary theory, as you know from your introductory course, was scientific management. This idea that we could study the work processes within organizations in a scientific way, that we could deconstruct these work processes, analyze them, and then come up with this one best way to do each one of these jobs. A very scientific type of approach to studying management within these bureaucratic organizations. Taylor felt we needed a science of management for a variety of reasons. And when you look at when Frederick Taylor was developing his theories, it was the early 1900s. Scientific management really came into its heyday in the 1920s. But you think of the early 1900s, we had a situation, a lot of our organizations, and again, he was writing primarily for the private sector, but a lot of these corporations, a lot of these factories, we had a situation where you didn't have middle managers. We essentially had top level leaders in the organization, and then we had the everyday employees who were doing the work. But there is very little communication that was going on between the leaders of the organization and the people on the front line of that assembly line doing the work on a daily basis. So we really lacked the middle managers that we tend to see in today's modern organizations. And that was a problem for Taylor. He thought we really needed that conduit between leadership and everyday employees. He said, because of the lack of middle management, we also had very little supervision and little guidance going on for how these employees should be doing their jobs on a daily basis. So this scientific management would then provide us or provide those employees with more supervision and more guidance. And if you read books like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, you knew what the situation was in a lot of these factories in the early part of I guess, of the 20th century, as the idea of a lot of labor unrest. We had a lot of conflict within these organizations. We had people who are getting injured, people who are losing their life through these types of labor battles at the time. And he felt scientific management could really quell a lot of those problems. Damien, it says in text chat, did Weber purposely avoid the human aspect of bureaucracy or simply wasn't mindful of it? In comparison to Taylor, I saw Taylor as an individual that purposely avoided the human aspect. It appears that his main focus was in finding the best way and all else human will fall in line. I think you're exactly right, Damien, is that Weber may not intentionally have dehumanized individual employees. It's just he didn't have much of a focus on them. Taylor was the one who intentionally dehumanized them. If you read any of the work by Frederick Taylor, you'll see him referring to people as being boorish beasts. That's language you didn't see from Max Weber, but that's language you see very clearly from Frederick Taylor. He said people were boorish beasts. He felt that they were unmotivated. He felt that they weren't very intelligent. They had to be instructed on what to do and then monitored every day to make sure they did what they were supposed to do in the way in which they were supposed to do it. These people had no value beyond basically what they contributed to the organization. He also referred to them as being the cogs in the machinery of the organization. And so if a cog breaks in the machinery of the organization, you take that cog out, you throw it away, and you replace it with a new cog. So you're exactly right. I agree with you, Damien. Weber was less intentional with his dehumanizing aspect. Taylor was much more intentional about it, and you see that come through loud and clear in most of his writings. So he develops this idea of let's come up with a science of management where we can, instead of looking at the structure necessarily, we can look at the work processes and we can study those work processes in a scientific way. We can deconstruct them and look at all the different elements of the work And then we could, by looking at all the different elements of the work, we can come up with what he considered to be the one best way to do the job. He felt that these very lazy, not very intelligent individuals, what Douglas McGregor in human resource management theory would refer to as Theory X individuals, these Theory X employees, they were really just soldiering, is what he referred to it. They were doing as little as they needed to do to get by on a daily basis. So they weren't going above and beyond. They had no real incentive and motivation to be productive. Their motivation was to do as little as they could to avoid getting in trouble. And that's what we refer to as the process of soldiering. He wanted to get rid of that process of soldiering by defining standards for performance of each job that was being carried out within the organization. He said when we develop those standards for performance, we can then also develop the standards necessary for selecting the quote unquote right employee for a job. That there are different employees out there, different prospective employees, different applicants out there who have different skill sets. We need to be very intentional at selecting the people who have the skill set to be able to do the job. So this is a job that requires, his basic example was the shoveling of pig ore, a very simple, very basic job. If you're hiring someone to shovel pig ore, you need someone who is obviously physically fit. You need someone who can certainly lift a good deal of weight because pig ore, shovelfuls of pig ore, they're not light. And so you had to get people who had those types of requisite skills to do the job. We could set standards to systematize the production process. And this is where he came along with his time motion studies. So the primary data collection method he used in scientific management were these time motion studies. So a time motion study is very similar to what you would have with a performance or productivity specialist. So someone will come in and watch a job being done. They will deconstruct that job into its component elements. So for the shoveling of pig ore, we look at how long it would take the person to pick up a shovel, how long it would take them to put the shovel into the pile of pig ore, how long it would take them to pick up the shovel, how long it would take them to take this shovel over to a cart, how long it would take them to dump the pig ore into the cart, how much time would it take them to go back to the original pile and start the job over again. You'd literally stand behind them with a stopwatch and you would time every single motion that individual took. So there are some motions that were effective and that helped the job to get done in an effective way. So, if they're shoveling at the proper angle, so they're getting the maximum amount of pig ore that they can carry in the shovel, that would be what he considered to be a true movement. That's a movement that contributes to doing the job in a productive way. However, if you have an individual who, whenever they turn to put the pig ore into the cart, they take a false step or they take 3 steps instead of 2 steps. Well, 3 steps will slow them down. So that's what he considered to be a false movement. You would take all those false movements and you would eliminate them from the job. You would collect all the true movements together, and that would then systematize the job into what he considered to be the one best way to do that particular job. So through this time motion study, once you've identified the one best way to do every job in the organization, you then teach your employees. You hire first, we back up to hiring, you recruit and hire people who have the skills to be able to do all those true movements in the one best way. Once you bring those people into the organization, you then train them in how to do the job in that one best way. Again, one best way is a universal, one size fits all approach, but you teach them the one best way to do the job. You then monitor them on a daily basis, and this is where your middle managers come in. You need to have some middle managers who can supervise these employees on a daily basis to make sure they are doing the jobs in that one best way. When employees are doing their jobs in that one best way and they're being efficient and they're being productive in their jobs, you then reward them. So pay for performance, remuneration was a major aspect of scientific management with Frederick Taylor. So if they're doing the job right, you give them rewards for that. You pay them appropriately. However, if you have an employee who is not doing the job in that one best way, you simply remove that person from the position. You fire them, they're a broken cog, you pull them out of the machinery, you then replace them with a brand new shiny cog that will do the job in that one best way. So Frederick Taylor does share some similarities with Max Weber, the focus on the one best way to do something, also the focus on task specialization. So people are specializing in these tasks, not just the employees, but the middle managers as well. Because for a middle manager to be able to monitor the performance of an employee and hold that employee accountable, that middle manager needs to know the one best way to do the job as well. So you've got task specialization not only for the employees, but also for your middle level managers. So a very scientific way of trying to deconstruct each individual job to come up with the one best way to do every job in the organization. And again, if you're able to do that, that's how you then make your organization effective as well as efficient. So for Frederick Taylor, as we said, as Damien pointed out, one of the primary problems with Frederick Taylor was the dehumanizing aspect of his theories. Whenever you refer to someone as a boorish beast, whenever you completely disregard the social aspects of the organization, and you treat this person just as a part of the machinery, obviously that's going to be a deficiency in your theories. And that's the major deficiency that a lot of our human relations theorists picked up on. And it really provided the impetus for those human relations theories to develop their own school of thought to counter those criticisms with scientific management. So in terms of scientific management and the models of organizational effectiveness, they very closely mirror the same models that we saw with Max Weber and his ideal bureaucracy. There is a rational goal approach in that you have goals here for being as productive and efficient and effective as possible. But there's very much an internal process approach as well. And I think if you had to weigh the two, I think you would shade in the box for internal process a little bit more than the box for rational goal model. And one of the things I advocated for in this new edition of the Tompkins textbook were kind of gradations in terms of his interpretation of these different models of organizational effectiveness, different shading mechanisms, so that it could be some shaded a little darker, some shaded a little lighter, because they're not necessarily all equal. Shading them both the same color kind of gives you the idea that they're equal. I would say the internal process model is more important here than probably the rational goal model. So you've got very much of this internal focus, looking at the processes within the organization, and very much an emphasis on control, that the work is being controlled by these middle level managers. Mechanisms for control and coordination of work, you've got a lot of standardization. Primarily, you have standardization of work processes, standardization of work outputs, because if you have the standardized process should then result in a standardized output. Well, I part company with Tompkins here a bit in that I would also emphasize standardization of worker skills, because he talks a lot about hiring the right employee with the right skill set in order to do these jobs. So I think standardization of worker skills is also an important mechanism that was favored under scientific management. In terms of motivational strategies, you've got primarily legal compliance, just like what you saw with Max Weber's theories. But here you have rewards for performance. Here you actually have Taylor saying if someone's doing the job properly and doing it in an efficient and effective manner, that person should get remuneration. They should get benefits of getting that pay for performance. So Frederick Taylor is really kind of the first one now in the 1920s who is starting to advocate for compensating people for a job well done. Now, again, he was writing primarily for private sector organizations where that was very possible. Today, as we all know, in the public sector, it's much more difficult for us to have pay for performance systems for a variety of reasons, because of our career civil service system and position classifications and pay bands and pay grades. Also because of the existence of public sector employee unions. That also makes it difficult because a lot of these unions are not very favorable toward pay for performance, because they kind of see pay for performance as very much of a slippery slope. But that's our second, what we consider classical theorist, Frederick Taylor, and his scientific management approach to trying to make organizations effective and efficient. But again, the overarching similarities between the two, Weber and Taylor are both taking a very organizational focus, so a very macro level focus, as we talked about last week, kind of the institutional level focus. And they're also taking this approach of we can come up with this uniform umbrella theory that can then be applied across the board to all of our organizations, irrespective of some of the different contextual variations between those different organizations. The nice thing about Weber and Taylor is, again, when you take this very one size fits all approach, it's a simplistic approach. It makes it very easy for us to study organizations. It's not accurate, but it's a very easy way to study an organization. What we have learned over almost 150 years of organization theory is we have learned that that's just not possible, and that we do have to take a more contextual approach, which makes our understanding of organizations, our study of organizations, much more complicated, much more complex. A third author that I kind of like to, for simplicity purposes, kind of clump together into what I consider to be more of a classical type of theorist is this person by the name of Henri Fayolle. And Henri Fayolle really suggests to us that we need to look at our organizations a little bit differently than how we looked at them under Weber and Taylor. I think Fayolle makes an interesting argument that when you only focus on management, you kind of lose sight of the forest for the trees, in that management is only one aspect of the overall governance of the organization. So Fayolle told us we have to take a step back. And if we want to make our organizations effective and efficient, we need to study those organizations in terms of how we are doing the overall governance of those organizations. The governance of an organization certainly does include management skills and how we are managing the personnel and the resources within our organization. But that's only one aspect. The governance of an organization also includes things like technical activities, commercial activities, financial activities, security activities, and what he calls accounting activities. So, technical activities. By technical activities, Fayolle is essentially saying that we need to look at the everyday work of the organization. What types of technologies, what types of technical steps do we go through? And taking the inputs in our organization and converting those inputs into outputs. So, what are we doing on a daily basis to create the goods and services that we are creating? Those are technical activities, and that's part of the governance of the organization, governing those technical activities. Since we also have to engage in commercial activities. Commercial activities for Fayolle are activities where we are exchanging resources with organizations and groups and people external to our organization. So we engage in the exchange of resources with other organizations, other agencies, with the public, with elected officials. Those are kind of those commercial types of activities. Now, we have a different type of commercial activities, I think, in the public sector than you may have in the private sector. In the private sector, you certainly have these transactions that go on between a company and its customers. We may not have the same type of transactions. Our transactions are a little bit different with our citizens, but those still constitute those commercial types of activities, those transactions. Financial activities. As an organization, we know that money is the lifeblood of any organization. Norton Long tells us that. If we don't have the money to operate, our organization is going to go out of existence. So we have to engage in financial activities, generating revenue, deciding where that revenue should come from. Should that revenue come from appropriations? Should that revenue come from grants? If that revenue is coming from grants, should it come from restricted grants? Should it come from unrestricted grants? Which donors do we want to rely upon? So we have to engage in those types of financial activities, the flow of revenue in our organization. Also, we have an outflow of revenue in terms of expenditures. And so those expenditures are also financial activities as well. Security activities. We engage in activities whereby we secure our employees, We also secure our intellectual properties that we are creating as well. This is one of the major concerns currently in higher education. As things continue to move online, and you have all these, what do they call them, the MOOCs, whatever they call them, these, huge classes that are being offered online in terms of open source. Well, someone develops those courses. And when you develop those courses, is that your intellectual property, or does that intellectual property then develop to that institution that you're developing the course for? Securing that intellectual property is certainly very important. You think about in terms of tech, it's one of the paramount concerns of a tech company is to try and secure their intellectual property. And accounting activities, balance those revenues and expenditures and making sure that money is being spent the way in which it is supposed to be spent. All those audits that we do in the public sector, examples of accounting activities, using different types of fund-based accounting, general funds and special revenue funds and debt service funds and all these other types of funds. If you've ever worked in the government, you know that there are multiple funds. When I was on the school board, we had no less than 25 different funds in our district budget. And it's all managing what money goes into what fund and comes out of what fund. Those are those accounting activities. So essentially, you're doing a lot in governing your organization that can go beyond just management. And so I think it's important that FAIL kind of instruct us that we have to think more from a perspective of governing the organization as opposed to simply managing the organization. So when we are governing the organization, FAIL tells us there are some essential functions that we have to engage in. And he provides to us 5 essential functions. The first one is planning. All organizations and all leaders and managers and organizations engage in strategic planning. Um, we do have a strategic planning course here in our MPA program. It's not offered, I think, every semester. I think it's offered every other semester. But strategic planning is incredibly important for organizations. And if you're looking for an elective to take, strategic planning may fit the bill for you. But we all engage in strategic planning. That's an essential function that all organizational managers engage in. We all engage in organizing. We have to organize the work that's going on within our organization. Who does what, how, and when. 3, we engage in the commanding function. We have to command what gets done and how that gets done. Oftentimes it happens in a very top-down type of nature in bureaucratic organizations. We have to coordinate functions and coordinate what this unit's doing with what this unit's doing to help the organization achieve its goals. And number 5 function is controlling. We have to control people, we have to control expenditures and money, we have to control access, we have to control decision making. So we engage in a lot of control. Planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling are the 5 essential functions that need to be done to make an organization effective according to FAIL. In order to carry out these 5 essential functions, FAIL then put together a series of principles of management, principles that we can teach to our managers in order to make our managers effective, which will in turn make our organizations effective. Some people, when they talk about Henri Fail, they talk about him in terms of what they call the School of Administrative Management. Some people will take Henri Fail and put him into the principal school. I consider him to be a classical author, but I do think that he kind of provides us with the basis for what will eventually emerge as what was called the Principal School of Management, because he provides us with his own principles of management. Things such as division of work, just like what we saw with Max Weber. Authority creates responsibility. The idea that if you put somebody in charge of something, that authority will then make them responsible for making sure that that gets done in an effective and efficient manner. Discipline. You have to have discipline within your organization as a basic principle of management. Unity of command, just like what we saw with Max Weber and his ideal bureaucracy. Subordination to the general interest, subordinating private personal interests to the general interest of the organization. Because again, FAIL, just like Weber and Taylor, has this kind of institutional macro level approach at the organizational level. What is in the best interest of the organization as opposed to necessarily in the best interest of the individual? Remuneration, compensation, much like we saw with Frederick Taylor, centralization, like what we saw with Max Weber, chain of command, like we saw with Max Weber, order, like we saw with Max Weber, equity, like we saw with Weber, and to a little lesser extent with Taylor. Stability of personnel, we saw with Max Weber with his idea of career professional employees. Initiative. Now, this is where we start to part company a little bit from Weber and Taylor. So, this principle of initiative, providing people with the opportunity and the incentive to take the initiative, to think of different ways of doing things and trying new things out. That's something we didn't see with Weber and Taylor, and so that kind of moves us a little bit away from those two authors. And then the last one is probably his most important one, and that's esprit de corps. An esprit de corps is this feeling of teamwork, this feeling that we are all in this situation together. We're all working together to try and achieve the same goals for the organization. That feeling of esprit de corps is kind of a psychological type of addition that we didn't see with Weber and Taylor. So with these principles of management that we get from Henri Fail, there's a lot of overlap with the other classical theorists, but he's also started to give us this more psychological type of orientation through developing initiative and developing this esprit de corps, this feeling of kind of being in it together, this feeling of teamwork. These principles then need to be implemented because principles on paper are all well and good, but if you cannot implement those principles in real life, they're going to do you no good. So he says, in order to implement these principles, we need to first understand the situation we are in that organization. That's what he calls this survey step. So we survey where we are at, we survey our conditions to understand which of these principles we lack, which of these principles we need to implement. Once we've identified which principles need to be implemented, we then have to put together a plan for implementing those principles. So, what principles are we implementing? When are we implementing them? And who is going to be involved in that implementation? So, you have to have a strong, cohesive plan for implementing those principles. So, how are we going to implement esprit de corps? What steps are we going to use to make people feel that they're all part of a family or all part of a team? And who is responsible then for doing that? We have to have reporting mechanisms in place so that we report upon our success in implementing these principles. And then, just like with Max Weber, we have to write it all down. We have to document our successes and our failures in implementing these principles within our organizations. So Henri Fail develops all these principles, but some of these principles, as we said, go beyond Weber and Taylor in that they're focused more on psychological types of factors. And so we see Fail kind of approaching this from a more psychological background. So we have Max Weber approaching this from a more sociological background. We have Frederick Taylor approaching it from a more business type of background. We have Henri Fail, who is focusing on more of a psychological type of background in developing his principles. And then James Mooney, who also developed a set of principles as well. His principles really build off of Fail's, but the difference between Mooney's principles approach compared to Fail's principles approach is that whereas Fail was more psychological in his orientation, Mooney is more structurally based in terms of his orientation to his principles. Mooney has a much more concise list of principles. So as opposed to those 14 or however many principles we had with Fail, Mooney gives us three basic principles for every organization to adhere to: the coordinative principle, the scalar chain principle, and the functional principle. Of those three, it's the functional principle that really became the calling card for Mooney. And this is what Mooney is best known for. But first, let's start with the coordinative principle. Mooney tells us one of the major principles of organization is the ability to coordinate the functions and activities within the organization. That as a leader or manager, You need to be able to coordinate all the work that's going on within your organization. This is especially true for large disaggregated organizations. The thing is, as organizations age, they tend to become larger and they tend to become more disaggregated, which makes it more difficult for us then to coordinate all these different functions. The second one, the scalar chain principle, we're very familiar with our good friend Max Weber. We know what that is. Everyone has someone who they are responsible to. We have this scalar chain in terms of our organizational structure. But it's the third one that really set Mooney apart and really gave Mooney some credence in terms of his inclusion in a class like this. Mooney's functional principle. Here, for the first time, Mooney is telling us that perhaps we need to treat employees differently depending upon what type of employee they are. This is a really important point. He says we need to understand the functions of those employees and then treat employees with certain functions differently than employees with other functions. Primarily in terms of this functional principle, he tells us that there are two main types of employees. There are line employees and there are staff employees. Line employees, according to Mooney, are those employees who are actually delivering the goods and services to citizens on a daily basis. These are what Michael Lipsky calls the street level bureaucrats. These are the ones who are on the front lines of actually interfacing with and interacting with citizens. Those are your line employees. Then you have a second category of employees called your staff employees. Staff employees are those kind of behind the scenes employees who provide the resources to make the work of the line employees possible. So they're the ones who are going to provide the communication devices to those line employees. They're the ones who are going to manage the pay and benefits, the HR functions for those line employees. They're the ones who are going to match the budgets and provide the allocations of money to those line employees so that they can go out there and do their job, whether it be providing them with their assigned vehicle or providing them with their route or whatever the case may be. Those staff employees are the support employees. So it's important because for the first time, we're now talking about being able to look at the functions of employees and understand that different employees have different functions, they have different needs, and they need to be treated differently depending upon their function. This is a nuance that we did not have with Weber, Taylor, or Fail. And so this nuance of looking at line versus staff employees kind of starts to move us a little bit away from the classical view of Weber and Taylor and kind of gives us a little crack in the door a bit to moving towards some of the neoclassical theories that we'll talk about primarily next week. But hold on to that idea because this is really the first time that we've talked about differences between employees and recognizing those differences between individual employees. Mooney, because he focused more on the structure and the positions within the organization, he's again coming at from kind of a private sector type of orientation. But our next classical theorist, who also falls in line with these principal theorists like Fayol and Mooney, is really our first true public administration theorist. And that is our good friend Luther Gulick. And I'm sure you were introduced to Luther Gulick earlier in the program. Luther Gulick, we kind of think about as more of a public administration theorist because he's really the first theorist who is able to develop theories and then apply those theories in practice to public organizations. Now, granted, scientific management back in the 1920s, once it really became very popular in the private sector, people started taking it and applying it to public organizations. But it wasn't necessarily Frederick Taylor who was doing that application. It was people who saw it working in the corporations and then started to apply it. Here we have Luther Gulick, who actually has a venue and actually has a platform for applying it to public sector organizations. Luther Gulick was a member of the Brownlow Commission. The Brownlow Commission, as you may remember from your 500 class or from a history class, the Brownlow Commission was put together to try and reorganize the federal bureaucracy to make the federal government easier for the president to manage. In the 1930s, as we know, we had the New Deal programs established by FDR. Those New Deal programs created what we call the alphabet agencies. alphabet of agencies, all these different agencies that were created to implement all these different programs to help state and local governments recover from the problems of the Great Depression. What that led to was an explosion in the size of the federal bureaucracy, which made it next to impossible for a singular president to manage this huge federal bureaucracy. So along comes the Brownlow Commission, and its primary charge was to reorganize the federal bureaucracy to make it easier for the president to manage. Luther Gulick was on the Brownlow Commission and was the leader of the Brownlow Commission. And the Brownlow Commission provided him with the opportunity to take his theories and actually put them in practice in reorganizing the federal bureaucracy in what would become the Reorganization Act for the federal branch. So Luther Gulick believed that in order for us to be effective as organizations, we needed to have effective managers. In order to have effective managers, we needed to teach our managers these principles of effective management. Things such as planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. So as we said before, when you see the overlap here with FAIL, but as we said before with FAIL, all managers have to engage in strategic planning. That's an elemental function of organizations. We have to develop goals, long-term and short-term goals, ways to achieve those long-term and short-term goals. That's an aspect of management. That's a principle of management. Organizing, we've talked about that before. Staffing. All organizations have to engage in staffing. They all have to staff their organizations with personnel who have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the jobs they need to do on a daily basis. Directing, managers need to direct the work of those individual employees. They need to coordinate that work. That's the coordinative principle of Mooney that we also saw with FAIL. Reporting, which we saw with FAIL as well, and budgeting. We have to be able to raise money. We have to be able to manage that money and to spend that money. So planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting are principles that underlie every single organization. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a public organization or a private organization, all organizations engage in those basic principles. What Gulick argues to us is that we can view these principles as basically a managerial toolkit. So we can provide our managers with this toolkit in terms of how to plan, organize, staff, direct, coordinate, report, and budget. And then our managers, whenever they need to engage in planning, they have those skills to engage in planning. When they need to staff, they have the skills they need to staff. When they need to budget, they have the skills they need to budget. So Gulick believed the most effective way to make an organization effective, to help an organization achieve its goals, is by providing our managers with these principles. What's come to be known as POSCORE, which is just the acronym for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. This is what's come to be known as the School of POSCORE. Now, again, this goes on in both public as well as private sectors. But what Gulick did is when they did the reorganization of the executive branch, he started to implement these principles into the executive branch itself. So it kind of makes some sense. Okay, here are these principles. All managers need to engage in these principles. They all have to understand how to do these things. If we can teach them how to do these things, we can make them effective managers. Effective managers will then result in effective organizations. However, not everyone agreed. And there are some really kind of biting criticisms of the approach of Gulick, FAIL, and Mooney, this idea that we can rely upon these principles of management. One of those biting criticisms comes from a man by the name of Herb Simon. And Herb Simon is someone who is all over the public administration literature. And one of the things that Herbert Simon was very good at is he was very good at not just developing his own theories, but developing critiques of other people's theories as well. And that's something that a lot of people in academia can really make a great career at, is in finding flaws with other theories that have been developed by other people. Herbert Simon referred to the principles approach as what he referred to as the proverbs approach. So he said, this isn't a principle school, this is a proverb school. He said, these aren't principles. Planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, budgeting, those aren't principles. Those are proverbs. And just like any proverb, you can find one proverb to cancel out another one. That is that you read one proverb and this is what the proverb tells you. You can find another proverb that tells you something completely different. So he says that they really do end up being conflicting with each other. And so, how can you plan when you have to staff? How can you direct when you have to coordinate? And so they end up canceling each other out. Dwight Waldo, another person who is all over the public administration literature, and you've probably read Dwight Waldo before in the program. His criticism is that they are not as much principles as they are prescriptions. He says, whenever you call something a principle, you're presenting it as something that is a scientific fact. This is something that's a principle of science, it's a scientific fact, it's something that exists as a scientific fact. He said these principles are not scientific. These principles are value laden. And the values that they are meant to try and foster are the values of control, centralization, and to a degree, exploitation of workers. Then, when you say that if we can teach our managers how to engage in all these different principles, you are taking all the power and you are placing it within the hand of these leaders and managers. It's a very centralizing, very top down, control oriented type of an approach. And he said basically, these principles are being used to foster that type of an ideology. So, not everyone bought into the principles approach, but the principles approach, as introduced by Luther Gulick into the federal government, really did lead to this complete reorganization of not only the organizations within the federal government, but how these organizations were managed and how they interacted with each other. An example of that could be the Bureau of the Budget, what is known now as the Office of Management and Budget. In the wake of the Reorganization Act, in the wake of the Brownlow Commission, the Bureau of the Budget took on a much different function than it had when it was created back in the 1920s. When it was originally created, its primary function was to be a clearinghouse for the president's budget. So whenever the president put out a call for budgets from all the agencies, it would collect all those budgets and provide them to the president. It was just merely a kind of objective, benign clearinghouse. As a result of its reform under the Reorganization Act, it became much more of a management based organization, where it then started trying to implement some of the president's policy agenda across all these different agencies. And it really did become very much a management arm for the president, so much so that it became the Office of Management and Budget in the 1970s to replace its old name of the Bureau of the Budget. So it really did have a big impact upon the structure and the function and really the complexion of the federal bureaucracy. And so he really was the first one who was able to develop these theories with public organizations in mind, and then apply these theories directly to the public sector. So if we take Fayol and Mooney and Gulick and we take them together in their principles approach together, and we look at the principles authors in terms of models of organizational effectiveness, again, you've got the same models that you were looking at with Weber and Taylor. You've got the rational goal model, and you also have the internal process model. For many of the same reasons, you had that with Weber and Taylor. In terms of the mechanisms for coordination and control, like Dwight Waldo tells us in his criticism, it was very much about top-down control, very much about direct supervision. And so the primary method for controlling is top-down through direct supervision of employees. And then in terms of our motivational strategies, again, very much in line with the other classical theorists, legal compliance, holding people in to accord for their actions based upon rules and regulations and policies and procedures. And since we have these principles theorists like Fayol and Mooney and Gulick who share so many of the same models and mechanisms and motivational strategies as Weber and Taylor, I tend to group them together under this very large rubric of the classical school of organization theory. With Luther Gulick, we are now taking it up through the 1930s and 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s. And so we have now moved up primarily through the late 40s and early 50s is kind of where we kind of draw the line as the end with the principal school as part of this classic school of organization theory. Again, these theorists had some differences, which we have highlighted, but the primary similarities between them is they all still focus on the organization. What was good for the organization as opposed to focusing on what is good for individual employees. And that was the primary criticism of the entire classical school that then eventually gave rise to a neoclassical school such as the School of Human Relations and Human Resource Management. So that takes us through a presentation of the classic School of Organization theory, again, taking us from the late 1800s up through the 1940s. Questions or observations or comments on Weber, Taylor, Fayol, Mooney, or Gulick, or any of these classical organization theorists? Probably the most appropriate question now is, when are we going to take a break? And the answer to that question is now. So it is 7:25. So let's say about a 15-minute break. Let's come back at 7:40. And then I promise you breakout rooms at the last session. We didn't have time for it. We will do that tonight. So we come back at 7:40. We'll break up into groups. We'll probably do 2 or 3 groups. And then I have an assignment here for us to work on, but we'll worry about that when we come back from break at 7:40. So see you back here in about 15 minutes.